Welcome to Leadership in Tech, a bi-weekly podcast series on software engineering and product development. I'm your host, Pradipe Yoggi, a senior engineering leader with more than a decade of senior leadership experience in public and PE-backed tech companies. The views expressed by me or my guests are not the views of my employer or those of my guests' employers. Take a listen, share, subscribe, and comment. Hey, James, welcome.
Hi, Pradeep. It's good to see you.
Hi. Yeah, good to see you. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a little bit.
Yeah. So thank you for being on the Leadership in Tech. You're doing the first episode of it. I'm really honored to have you here.
I'm very excited.
Good. Well, let's jump into it. Let's introduce yourselves. So for people that are watching this, I'm a VP of engineering right now. But I have had about 10 plus years of experience in leadership. And James, I know that you've had a long history of leadership roles. Maybe you can just give a brief intro to people.
So right now I'm the head of technology at a company called Dempaflux. I'm in Munich. Before that, I was in the US. I had about 10 years of management experience at a company called PhotoShelter that did digital asset management. And prior to being into management, I was working as a software engineer at PhotoShelter and gradually transitioned into the management role.
Nice. So as we explore the topic of leadership, now with your own path to senior leadership roles, how did that come about?
It kind of came about in a kind of what seemed like a very natural progression. So as I said, I was at PhotoShelter and I was there as a senior software engineer, and it was a SaaS startup. So there was 2 or 3 of us, and then the team was gradually growing. So I took on a tech lead role, and I was involved in hiring, and then moved into more of a management position. Eventually, I think my first formal management title was actually director of engineering. And the whole process seemed like kind of a very natural step from one role to another. I was also interested in learning the management skills. I thought maybe at some point I would like to have my own startup or entrepreneurship. And so that was one aspect of, let me learn these skills that could be useful for me in the future. And then another aspect was a desire more for ownership and responsibility. Like it was a small startup, and if something was going to go wrong on the tech side or there's going to be a mistake to be made, I actually wanted to be my mistakes, and not necessarily at the whim of somebody else. So that's how I ended up.
Nice. Kind of reflects some of how I progressed in different roles, myself growing through the ranks. And I find that to be one of the best ways to lead, because you sort of like have a really good understanding of the code, the architecture, the business domain, and you're naturally set up to lead. So it's great to see that you had a similar path there.
Yeah, it works because if you know the people you're working with, you're not getting dropped into a situation, and hopefully that there's been some respect as a senior engineer, and so as you're making the transition, that they're supporting you as well in the transition.
Yep. Now, as you lead and bring value to your organizations, what values, I guess, any notable values that you adhere to or go by?
For me, I really like to be open and honest. I try to be as transparent with my reports as I can be. And the the reason behind that is because I believe having proper context, having the background, the more people know, the more they can make better decisions for themselves.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things I believe strongly in for management.
I think that's a good point, because I think, when the team knows everything that is going into decision making or key aspects of the development process and so forth, I think there's a lot of buy-in that happens.
Yeah, and like a lot of times, if there's a lack of communication, people start wondering what's going on, or they get suspicious. Yeah. And in my experience, there's not really anything that secret that people can't know about to take place. Generally, the more they know, that they're going to be more bought in, and they'll be able to make better choices.
Yeah, that's great. So the transparency is a key from your observation in terms of how you bring value to an organization as you lead, right?
Yeah, and I think it's also part of my responsibility to help educate people, to teach them, because there were things I would want to know when I was a software engineer that wasn't necessarily being communicated. But if people are going to make advance in their career, the more they can be exposed to, the earlier, the more they can grow, and the more they can make an informed choice when the time comes for them. So
yeah, that's a great point, I think. Yeah, I didn't think of that. That it has an impact far beyond yourself and your immediate role, and impacts future leaders as they grow into those roles. That's great. So now I see the clock there is like 8:25 or something. So I figure you're in Munich, Germany. So tell me, how is it like working in Germany and living there compared to working and living in the United States?
So it's been interesting, because there's definitely the German stereotype of they like their rules and regulations, and that's actually quite a bit true. Also, coming from the U.S., compared to Germany, the U.S. feels like a free-for-all in terms of employment protections or lack thereof, or the interaction between employees and employers. And in Germany, it's kind of very structured. There's lots of employee protections. There's lots of rules or regulations on what employers can do. They have to give, I think at least 20 days of vacation in Germany, which is certainly a nice regulation. I'm not going to argue against. But the flip side is, it makes things a lot more. It really does make things a lot more kind of onerous and slow and being considered. My experience is that German companies tend to be hesitant to hire because it's actually hard to fire. So you need to be much more deliberate in your hiring choices than you need to be in the US. And it doesn't feel like a positive, actually. It feels like it makes everything a little bit
slower.
A little bit slower, a little bit more difficult to decide, makes it harder to move fast. And I think it really doesn't, I shouldn't say generally, but for the software industry and definitely startups, we're kind of moving fast and having this vitality. It really doesn't benefit either the employer or the employee, because it just adds so much friction to the interaction.
Got it. Yeah, understand. So it's, I think it kind of fits this stereotype we've heard about Germany in terms of the rules and regulations and so forth. So did it affect you in terms of your role as a leader, hiring people, or having to enlarge your team, for growth?
It did. It actually heavily influenced the decision of whether we were going to make full-time hires or whether we were going to look for contractors or an agency. And so enough so that it pushed the needle to preferring an agency for a certain, like in certain situation, like it gives you flexibility to, especially as a startup and budget, whether you need to handle, increasing the load or reducing, um, depending on how well you're doing or how much money is coming. And so ended up having the flexibility, more flexibility, hiring through an agency. If we hired in-house staff for everything, it would have made it much more difficult to adapt to the environment, I'd say.
Yeah, fascinating. So, I think employee protection is a positive and a negative, right? So, the good side is that I guess there's more thought goes into the whole process rather than an email letting people know that they no longer have a job.
Yeah, in that sense, it's nice, and I think there's probably some medium between the U.S. model and the German model that would work well. And I think it also varies from industry to industry. I think a lot of the didn't research this, but I think a lot of the laws and regulations come more from manufacturing and blue collar work, where I think the rules kind of develop more naturally to fit that situation. But now, it's later, and now we have the software industry, and we still have the same rules, but it doesn't necessarily fit the software industry as well as it did maybe the prior industry when the rules were developed.
Got it.
Yeah.
Cool. And in terms of living there, how was it overall? I guess nice.
It's been very interesting. Munich itself is a really nice city. I have a family. I have two kids, and that aspect is the city is very safe. So it's been very comfortable to have
Nice.
my family here. It's been great to have, to be able to let my kids go into the city and not really have to worry about anything happening.
Uh-huh.
I think other nice parts is Munich is really close to the Alps. So that's been a very nice part of it. Yeah.
Cool. Do you ski?
I skied. I hadn't skied for like 20 years before I came here.
Nice.
My kids had wanted to ski, but I didn't have a chance to introduce them to it before. So when we got here, the winter we got here, I took my kids, got them ski lessons. There was a mountain like an hour away from us, and I got them hooked, which was good, which was nice.
That's awesome. Yeah. Fantastic. Cool.
Yeah.
So now, switching topics a little bit, going more into the leadership and management aspects. You've had a long, a stint of managerial roles and leadership roles. Have you uncovered like any myths about leadership and management from actually doing the roles?
Yeah, I think the one myth or one impression about management that I think people sometimes have, or when you're learning, that I don't think makes sense, and I haven't really seen work that often, is the need to be a tough manager, like that you need to always be cracking the whip or forcing your employees to work or continually having to like actively manage the employees. In some way, the term management itself is misleading, because you're not managing every day. It's you're trying to guide them, you're trying to inspire them, you're trying to make sure they have enough information so that they can be doing the work and they can be making the decisions themselves. And I think certainly in the software industry, my experience is generally the people I've worked with, they're all very much excited to be looking at code, and they're all very motivated. So like your job isn't to get them to work, your job is really to enable them to get the most out of what they're already excited to be doing. So yeah, I see that kind of as a myth of this idea that like the managers need to really be like tough all the time, or cracking the whip and
Yeah.
look. And it's I don't want to say it's never necessary. I mean, it's something you should have
Right.
tool belt as a manager, but it's something that you
Right.
should be using, rarely in circumstances that warrant it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think the other, or at least for me, when I was becoming a manager and I was, reading, up on the management books and trying to get trained and trying to learn the skills, is that that management itself is kind of counterintuitive. Generally, my experience was kind of what you think might be common sense or your first reaction on how to handle a situation is often not the best one. Right. And I think it kind of goes with the trying to be tough. You sort of like, oh, well, if my employee is not performing that well, I just need to be tough and tell them to work harder. Right. And that's kind of seems like a common sense idea. It seems intuitive, but my experience is you're going to be better off talking to the employee, trying to find out what's wrong. Is there something that matters, or something bothering you about the work? Is there something outside of work that is affecting you, that's interfering? And instead of being this tough guy, being somebody who is willing to talk and listen, and through that process, you could usually figure out what the underlying cause is, and then you could come up with a solution. And I find that to be much more effective.
I agree with that. It's very important to take stock of what's going on with the person's life, especially if you know that the person is, traditionally a good performer, and there's a dip, and you note that, and it's affecting a project. But yeah, I think having that two-way communication to uncover what's going on is such a key thing. So I think it's a very valid point, a very great point, I think, that you mentioned, which is don't go by what you think might be instinctively you want to do, but rather look back at it and see, is this the right thing to do? Or like take a pause and like really look at it again, right?
Yeah, take a step back and think it through. And I think you right, one way you can end up pushing your employee away, another one you can actually build loyalty and excitement, and appreciation. If the employee is going through a tough time and you're there and you make their life easier and you make their life better, they're gonna return that. When they can, right? When they're in a better position, they're gonna return that.
Right. The other day when we were talking, you mentioned about how important a role a manager plays in a person's life, right?
Yeah, so this is something I had read early on from Clayton Christensen, where he was talking about generally management as a profession, and one of the things he talks about is kind of management being this very noble profession. And why is that so? It's because you as a manager, you're working with people for 8 to 10 hours a day, and you really have an outsized impact on how their day goes. And and then you don't, right, and it's not just that person, right? Like you have an employee, and you could be a cranky, angry manager who ends up stressing out their employee. And one, that's not so good, because right, I want people to have good and fulfilling and happy lives, right? I don't want to be one causing stress for them. But it doesn't just stop at that person, because then they go home, and if they had a bad day and they're stressed, then what is the impact that has on their family or their kids or how they're responding? Versus if you could be a motivating and inspiring, manager, and your employee could go home energized, that has a big impact on their life and those around them. So it meant a lot, or it made an impression when I came across that from Clayton Christensen, of not thinking about it as
it's a very thoughtful way of looking at managing people, and how it's a significant responsibility, right? Because it's not just the immediate project, but you actually have an impact for out in society because of all the people you're touching as part of your day-to-day work running the organization. Great point on that. Now, um, being in leadership roles, how have you managed to balance any hands-on technical work, or how do you stay, I guess, sharp in terms of the actual technology?
So even when I'm in leadership position and managing, I'm always trying, maybe not always succeeding, but always trying to be involved in some code
Yeah,
somehow. Um, I mean, I got in this industry because I love programming, I love software engineering. Um,
yeah,
so being too far away from it is, can be frustrating. On the other hand, as a manager, you have responsibilities, and management tends to be very sort of interrupt driven activity.
yes,
Um, so I've made the mistake of the team being like, oh, we need to do X, Y, and Z, and being like, oh, I could help out with this piece, um, and then finding that I didn't actually have the time, and now there's a deadline, and now the team's like, hey, you need to give this to, you need to deliver this. So I don't necessarily advocate for working on mission critical pieces, but I do advocate for finding um, pieces that are not necessarily time sensitive, that are not necessarily mission critical, but that you could still be improving the product, or you could be um, refactoring code. For me anyway, is kind of one of those very fun aspects of, right, it's
mhm,
not critical, but I'm improving the code base, which benefits everyone. So yeah, so when I'm in leadership, I'm trying to find these types of work that could be done on the side, aren't necessarily time critical, but will still add value when they're completed.
nice. Yeah, yeah. That's an excellent point. I've noticed that as well. Like, tooling, things like working on tools that could help is another way to stay close and being involved in the architecture, right? Whiteboarding, all of those, all the key architectural decisions that get made. I think those are other ways I've found. But like you said, the original reason some of us or many of us came into this profession is because of the joy of writing code, and that's a that's always a tough balance to keep going. And it's great to hear that you find a way to make that happen.
Yeah, definitely try and find a way to make it happen. So,
Cool. So now, what are some challenges you've faced or experienced managing talented engineers,
um,
if there is any? I mean,
yeah,
maybe.
um, I think managing them is that they're talented, and they tend to have fairly strong opinions, and tend to have ideas of what they want to do or what they would like to do. Um, and I think the challenge is how to harness that and
Yeah.
guide it to where it's going to be valuable to the business, um, while still keeping them excited and motivated. And sometimes you're lucky, and the ideas they have are well aligned, and then sometimes you're less lucky, where they kind of want to go off in a different direction, uh, and then again it comes down to communication, talking to them, where the desire is coming from, what do they want to accomplish, um, communicating the needs of the business, and what their interests are, uh, and trying to come to a point or agreement where they could express what they want to accomplish, but actually are able to modify that idea so that so that everyone's kind of rowing in the same direction. Uh,
Right. That's a great point. And that leads to my next question, like, how do you handle disagreements within your group when it arises? Which I'm sure arises because when you work with really skilled and smart engineers, there's probably different views about how to build something or how to handle a specific situation, the code or architecture.
yeah, absolutely, and they'll have different ideas of how they want to handle something, or what tools, or what architecture or framework to use. This is something that I've actually changed a little bit recently on, where I was, I used to be worried about discussions and stuff getting heated and maybe people getting hurt because of that. And I've recently had, in the last couple of years, experiences where I realized that as long as you're creating a safe environment where people know that they're not being personally attacked, or it's not being insulting, or it's right, or it's not getting, I think where it's not turning into sort of personal attacks, that the process of having people discuss, sometimes getting a little bit emotional, maybe a little bit heated, is necessary often to get to a better point than you could otherwise. Because what I've seen happen recently play out, 2 or 3 times, is people discussing, oh, I think it should be done this way, or we're trying to do this, and the other person is like, well, no, we're going to try and do X, and I don't think that's right, and that goes on for a couple of rounds. You could see them getting a little bit frustrated, maybe a little bit heated, and maybe you feel the need to step in and cut it off or mediate it. But I found if you have that environment where people will still be friends afterwards, so to speak, that letting it go on, often they come to realizations that they wouldn't otherwise, and then being like, one point it was like, oh, wait, you were talking about X, and I thought, I was reading it as Y, and now I totally see what you're saying from your side, and it makes sense, and I'm really excited to do, some idea, some agreement, and they come together in a way that you end up with a better product or a better architecture. Whereas you would if you had cut it off too soon, they, maybe you would have compromised or figured something out, but you really missed out on that kind of epiphany and discovery of kind of letting the minds meet, and getting to that point. So,
Yeah, that's really insightful about how to, I guess, build a culture that is strong and vibrant. Because when you don't have that, the two things can happen, right? One, that the individuals can feel less motivated because they've really not come to a proper conclusion, but the conclusion is sort of forced. And the other is, I think I've found it myself that where you don't have such an open and honest culture, it results in people talking behind the backs, right? Having these unnecessary sort of, what do you call it? I wouldn't say rumors, but more like back, I don't know, like talking behind people's backs, right?
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely been in those environments, and you could be left with, hard feelings, and maybe you don't want to work with that person as much anymore, or it puts up barriers to communication, and it puts up distrust and distance in those. If you're in that type of environment, that could be ultimately demotivating.
So now, when you create such an environment, do you actually like step in and tell the rules of the game, as in like, guys, I want, like, when you have discussions, these are things that I expect to happen. Is it okay to happen? Do you like sort of like set a, what do you say, paint a background in which to operate in, I guess? Or is it more of an organic thing that people pick up as you interact?
It's more explicit. You need to talk about, or I believe you need to talk about, wanting that type of environment.
Right.
Making people, psychological safety being sort of that term of, how to create that environment, and making people feel like they could express themselves, that they're not going to be, ridiculed for expressing themselves. At the same time, people need to know that, they're expressing themselves, but it has to be about the work. It's not about the person.
Yeah.
Be professional. So you need to lay some of the groundwork, but I think also when it does start happening, you need to reassure people that it's okay, and maybe take the temperature, or there's a couple of times where we've had newer people join the team and then they see something like that happen and then they're uncomfortable because they're like, oh wow, that was really intense. And that's an opportunity to explain to them what the culture is and the environment, and to explain the benefits. And I think it's a little bit easier if they see a heated argument and then they see it come to a good resolution.
Yeah.
Because then you could explain, like, hey, what would have happened if I had stopped this argument, halfway through? Where do you think we would be? Would we be in as good a place or not? And that helps understand why it's necessary to maybe not police it so closely, to maybe let it play out a little bit more.
Nice.
But yeah, it needs to be intentional.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, the intentionality part is vital, I think, because otherwise it's like not clear as to what the rules of the game are, I think, and it's a good point. Now, kind of that leads to the next question, which is how do you balance like technical decisions with broader business goals? Right, you have these smart, high-skilled engineers wanting to build things, and we ourselves as engineering leaders have a certain bias sometimes of how far you go on building something. And then there's the business reality of like, this got to ship now. So how do you, what's your approach, I guess, to balancing these things?
I mean, it's always tough, and especially as an engineer, you kind of want to build the greatest perfect thing that you can, and you definitely need to put that side, behind you, or at least not make it as loud, because ultimately the people who are patronizing your business, your customers, your clients, they're not buying your code, generally, right? They are coming to your SaaS or your platform because they want to buy what they're able to accomplish with the platform.
Right.
And I don't want to say the code doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter to them, right? Like, if they're able to accomplish what they want to accomplish, then they're happy. And so I think that's one of the things that kind of, the transition that somebody has to make from a junior to senior developer, where I think the junior developers are generally very kind of focused on the code, and I'm going to make this code as great as possible. I'm going to make it elegant. I'm going to do as good as a job. Where the senior needs to be more of the context of, how fast this is needed, who is it needed by, right? How sensitive in the system? Where does this in the system? Is it really critical? It needs to be super robust, or is it something on the periphery that doesn't need to be necessarily bulletproof? Is it not going to see a lot of usage? Being aware of that context. Yeah. And so, kind of going back to the beginning of, making sure that the developers are aware of the bigger picture and the context and explaining, and they can make better decisions. I think that's part of it.
Cool. Yeah, that's an excellent point. And also a related question I had, which was I was thinking I would bring in later, but perhaps now it might be a good point to ask that question, is I guess you mentioned this difference between a junior and a senior developer or an engineer as to the difference in perspective that they bring to solving a problem or working on whatever piece they're given. I guess what's an advice you would have for somebody that is, say, new to technology, meaning, say, they are in their maybe high school or college, or maybe they're just they're doing something else and want to get into software development. What kind of an advice would you have for somebody like that is looking to get in to software development?
I think the advice for somebody looking to get into it is make your fundamentals really strong. Understand the craft of software development and software engineering, because if you're going to have a long career,
Yeah,
things are going to change a lot. From when you start to 15, 20 years in the future. And if you're able to give yourself a good, solid understanding of the fundamentals, and the basics, of what software engineering is, you're going to be able to adapt better than somebody who, I would say somebody focused learning on language because it was a popular language, and they're like, oh, I got really good in this language, I could program now. And it's like, don't stop there. Don't just learn one language. Learn, 2 or 3, because then you see the commonality between them, and you see the fundamental aspects of what becomes common, in the software engineering process, and what are the particular details of an individual language.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been surprised sometimes seeing people jump straight into like pretty advanced languages without knowing some of the underlying foundations of computer science, or even like logically breaking down a problem, right? Like how do you solve a problem? Break down a problem into smaller problems that can be solved, that you put together. I mean, when I initially learned programming, I remember flowcharting as a technique. I wouldn't recommend it as a day-to-day thing, but I guess when you're a newbie who's completely unused to the idea of having to like go as detailed as as you need to in computer programming, I think that was a good tool back then when I learned.
I think it's good because it forces programming is not what happens when you're typing things into the computer. This is kind of what I believe. Like, coding is not the programming part. Coding is what's happening in your head, where you're, as you said, you're breaking down a problem. You're trying to figure out other pieces. You're trying to figure out the architecture you should have. Like, to me, that's the software engineering part. That's the programming part. The coding part is just getting it out of your head into a form that the computer could access and use and bring to life.
Yeah, that's well said. Now, on the same vein, say somebody's a mid to senior level engineer, and they're looking to grow in their career. Based on what you have seen with other people that you have encountered in your leadership role, or you yourself have done, like what would be some recommendations or suggestions you might have for them?
So mid to senior, it's time to start thinking about more than just the code and the feature or the piece of work you're doing. You need to start becoming aware. Maybe not start, maybe you already are, but you need to lean into the context of that your work is happening in. So maybe starting, from your department, the impact that your work is having on your coworkers, which you're probably already doing at a mid-level and aware of. But, where does that work fit in, the larger engineering department, depending how large the department is? And then, where is that work fitting in terms of, product or sales or marketing, or business strategy, of starting to learn the why of what you're doing more.
Yeah.
Not just the what of here's this code and I need to ship this thing, but why is this thing even important? Why did they ask me to do this thing?
I didn't mean to cut you off. If you had more, say, go on, please.
No, I was going to also change a little bit direction. So there's that sort of the context and understanding the why. And I think as you get mid to senior, to start being able to improve, maybe start mentoring the effect you could have on the people around you, the coworkers. So not just what you yourself are doing and how good you are and how much code you can produce, but can you start, getting your coworkers and people around you, can you increase their level? You help them, start helping them grow and learn. And, can you leverage, as your senior, you're going to have a pretty good bit of knowledge. Can you leverage your knowledge and help the team as a whole grow and build on that knowledge?
Yeah, so that's a really great point, actually. It's I remember somebody mentioning something similar, which is not only are you growing yourself, but you need to make others around you grow as well. And that just results in a win-win overall. And I think that's also very important trait in a leader, right?
Yeah,
To not just pull oneself up, but also pull others up in the process.
yeah,
Uh, yeah,
exactly. It's really a team, and be able to make the team thrive as well, not just yourself.
yeah, yeah. Great. Now, what are you most excited about right now in the industry and why?
Uh, right now, I'm the whole LLM, AI
Yeah,
coding, vibe coding, whatever,
yeah,
um, is really exciting. And I definitely started off as a skeptic year ago, and just recently in the last few months, just we're talking to people and learning how they were using it. I was like, they were people I respected, and I was like, oh, that seems really cool. And I see how that works, and I see how that makes sense. And so I started playing with it. And, um, it's the the chatbots or the LLMs. They're somehow both amazing and like terribly bad at the same time. Like you'll do
yeah,
something, you're like, oh, I can't believe it just did that, and then you'll ask it something else, and you'll be like, oh, I can't believe it just did that. Like, right?
yeah.
And so yeah, I find it fascinating. I'm excited to play with it more. I'm excited to see where it goes and how it develops, the impact it
Yeah.
has.
So on that, how do you see these LLMs and AI technologies influencing product development and engineering?
So right now, I see it as it's a really powerful tool to have in your tool belt.
Yeah,
Um, I know people are talking about, oh yeah, sort of the vibe coding. Oh, just let the AI do all of the coding. Don't worry about it. Or they're gonna completely replace software engineers. It's just gonna be AI tools writing all the software. I don't believe that. I don't think that's going to be the case
yeah,
really anytime soon. But it's hard to progress, hard to make predictions about AI because it's very easy to end up being wrong. But um, the point of view right now is that they are powerful tools, and that you should be learning how to use them. You should be learning how to incorporate the tools into your development processes day to day, not as a replacement for
yeah.
you and your judgment, but as an as an addition, as an enabler, as a multiplier for you and your judgment.
Mhm.
Something to take advantage of.
Yeah. No, that's very well said. The multiplier. I
Yeah,
think that's where its immediate value is, and probably for a long time will be. I think because I think judgment ultimately is going to be a very human thing, as well as giving intention. Right,
yeah,
intention is going to be a very human thing. So these are, I guess, I think you said the equivalent of like being what with horse-driven carriages to cars. You mentioned something like that the other day. Um,
yeah. So I kind of always thought about the 20th century, especially the early 20th century, and what it must have been like to live through that time. Because I'm going to
yeah,
get the years wrong, but you basically went from like horse and buggy to cars, and I don't know, 20 years to airplanes, and like another 20 years to like landing on the moon. And
yeah,
so you went from literally horses to landing on the moon in something like 60 years. I don't know the exact, but it just a very compressed amount of changes in somebody's lifetime,
right,
go through those things. I think kind of as a child of the 90s, and I think we've been through changes, but they haven't felt as dramatic as I imagine the changes in the 20th century were. Like, I mean, the
right.
internet is really cool. Being able to email and stay in contact and play Mario Kart with friends halfway across the world is definitely new, and it's changed. But it seems like it was kind of, at least to me, kind of you could imagine it in the 90s. You can imagine something like that happening, right? When there's a horse and buggy, I don't know if you can really imagine
I
living
see what you
through it,
mean.
right? I mean, they're definitely science fiction writers who definitely did, but uh,
Right.
I think for the AI, I think it's going to be kind of crazy for the next 10 or 20 years, and I think we're going to have trouble imagining what actually comes out of all this AI stuff in 20 years, where it ends up.
Right.
And so that's why I don't know, I'm kind of excited. I'm a little bit older, so I'm also a little bit scared of where it might end up. But I
Yeah.
also I think it's just going to be an exciting time.
Yeah. I think you mentioned being a little bit scared. I think, one of the things is there's all these challenges with AI in terms of copyrights and um, safety of the data or information that you provide, right? Um, I guess, how do you balance that if let's say you were to start using AI tools in the software development process? That's a, I think that's still an unknown in terms of how to navigate that, right?
Yeah, and I think you worry about maybe your source code leaking out, or what's
Yeah.
the companies you're doing with it. I think they say they're not doing anything with it, right?
Yeah.
So we trust them. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I remember seeing the other day, I don't know, like maybe some months ago, oh, you're your programmer, work from home, $40 an hour, train LLMs. I think these are basically training the large language models to think and reason in terms of programming or whatever. But I thought it was fascinating that ultimately all of this AI is being powered by human intelligence, obviously. And yeah, I mean, yeah, the data safety and what happens to the data, I think, is a very key consideration. Still open out
Yeah,
there.
and what do they do when they start wiring up the AIs to more agents, and they can start doing
Yeah,
more real things out in the world? Uh,
right.
yeah, it's gonna be an interesting time.
Yeah. Well, switching topics a little bit, what is your take on hiring in tech? Like, what kind of things, I guess, gaps or issues you're seeing from your experience as a leader and also as somebody who's switched jobs and stuff? Has it changed for the better, for the worse?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it seemed a lot simpler when I got into the industry.
Right. Yeah.
You would talk to somebody, they would ask you technical questions, you would discuss, they would kind of figure
Yeah.
out and now you have these interviews at some places that could be very heavy. They could be leak code based, they could be homework assignments, it could be system design architecture interviews, these kind of very formalized and structured interviews. I don't know how effective they are, or um, yeah, they require a lot more time. I think leak code might be an issue as AI starts coming out of
Yeah.
whether you could actually whether the guy you're interviewing is the guy who's actually doing the programming, or whether something on the side solving the problems for him. Uh, I think my
Yeah.
recent experience in the market is it's become much more crazy. Uh, I think as software engineers we were a little bit maybe spoiled is too strong, but in the beginning of the 21st century, it was the demand was really high. And I've
Yeah.
noticed recently, speaking myself and speaking to friends and stuff like that, that's not the case anymore. That it's getting much harder to find for folks to find roles. Uh, I think talking to a couple of people, and I think some of my experience as well is that right now is not a great time for generalists. Um, I
Right.
think because since there's a large supply of people, companies could be pick and choose, and they could look for specialists a little bit more. They could look for people who are much more narrow matching of what they're having. And so I think
Yeah. Yeah. I
it's
think the change that you mentioned from, I guess a couple of decades ago to now in terms of how people get hired for technical roles, like people ask questions, you answered those questions, and you came in and did the job, right? I think there was a certain level of trust that if the person knows these things, they're going to obviously know how to code and use things. Um, I don't know what has changed. I think maybe a tolerance for I guess a faith in trying out people. I don't know. Something has changed. And I think back when I remember these questions that ask you to do whiteboards and all that stuff, I think it started with Google doing that. But they basically didn't look at all the experience you've built in your career, whatever. Here's a problem, solve it, right? And I think that culture then started getting replicated pretty much everywhere. Not that I'm complaining about it, but I also know people that are really good that are actually uncomfortable with such interviewing techniques, right? Like I know a senior architect from my past role who's like, I wouldn't be necessarily comfortable doing that kind of interviewing. And so like you're going to miss out on some really smart people who maybe it's a nerves issue or whatever. But yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I think it's also, I think there's also a difference between the Google and the really big companies and the,
right,
the other set of companies. Google is, um, and I was talking to somebody who working at Google at the time and was a bit involved in the recruiting. Google is very happy to uh, pass over uh,
right,
qualified candidates if it means that they have less false positives,
right,
right?
right,
So they're very happy to have false negatives in the case of, hey, this person's qualified, but we think he isn't, so we're not going to hire him, to avoid having a false positive where somebody isn't qualified. They end up hiring them. I think Google, companies of the size, can get away with that.
right,
I think at least the companies that I've worked at, smaller SaaSes and smaller startups, that's going to end up hurting you. You're going to end up missing
right.
people or too much, or your hiring processes end up being longer than necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think I had this realization about 10 plus years, which is what's your brand as an employer, right? Like the Facebooks and the Googles and Amazons, because of their brand. And I think the the thing is, when you have such a huge ratio of people wanting to join, and obviously you can have a whole bunch of false negatives, right?
Yeah,
Uh, yeah,
you could filter a lot of people out.
yeah. So, and I think that's very key in hiring. The judgment that one applies has to apply in terms of whether this person is a fit or not. For a smaller organization, a small organization that doesn't command that kind of brand in terms of hiring. But I think another thing that has contributed to the mess is just the online applicant tracking systems, right? It just floods the funnel, and there's no system to handle the funnel.
Yeah, and I spoke to a CTO I had worked with previously recently, and I put up a job and we had you know 700 or 800 resumes within one day.
How many?
700 or 800.
Wow.
Like, what do you do with that, right? Like,
Yeah, exactly.
you're not gonna. So it's tough. I mean, it's tough for the job seeker perspective, but there's it's also kind of tough for the employer who are looking for people as well.
Yeah,
Although I know which side I'd rather be on right now.
yeah, yeah. I wonder if somebody's going to employ AI to make that, with that kind of volume. I mean, obviously, it's not humanly possible to process 700 or 800 applications that show up in a day. But even if you give it to an LLM, how is it going to distinguish 700? How is it going to rank these people? And how do you validate that it ranked it correctly, right? Like, I mean, I think it's an interesting problem to look at, but um, yeah,
So yeah, no, it's challenging.
yeah. I think a thing that is missed out in recruiting is introducing people, right? Like people get hired, people getting hired because somebody knows somebody because of their work, because they worked with them in the past. I think it's a great system, and I see that being used less in this present context, which perhaps could help.
I think it's I think it's more important in the present context because if you have somebody who's able
Yeah,
to refer you or say, "Hey, I know who this guy is," you get your can get your resume kind of out of that stack of 700 resumes, and maybe somebody will actually look at it. So I think it's important to right now to try and lean on those the networks and friends and connections a little bit more than maybe it was in the past.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think in the age of AI, human connections might become more valuable. Uh, so,
That would be a very positive side effect if that's the way it worked out.
yeah, yeah, I think so. Um, so switching gears a little bit, the other day you mentioned something about wide, narrow, wide, and that was the first time I had heard about that. And the question that I'm going to give you is this about, you mentioned something about like the thing what I asked the other day was like a misstep that led you to learn and recover from it. Like, what did you learn from it? But how did you recover? And you mentioned this term wide. I don't know what that is, but
Yeah, I
maybe,
don't even.
yeah.
So yeah, so you'd asked, was there something I did wrong, and how did I recover from it, and what did I learn from
Right.
it? And there was this, I guess, earlier on in sort of my management career, we wanted to make a technical and architectural decision. We were looking at what web frameworks to use, and so React had come out, fairly recently. I don't even think it was a year old at that point in this discussion. And then there was also on the other side web components and Polymer. And so we wanted to modernize and rebuild part of our web stack. So I had a couple of developers, one advocating for React, the other for web components, and I started this discussion of what should the next step be. Can you give me the pros and cons of what you think the two frameworks are working? What we should recommend. And the mistake was that I only started with these two, more senior developers, and other developers in the company weren't aware that that conversation was going. And so
Okay.
that would be the narrow part, right? It was just these two people, and they'd done a bunch of research and they'd come up with recommendations, and then we had shared this with the wider company. And I was a little surprised by the reaction, because a lot of people were like, "Hey, what was going on? Oh, I feel left out. How come I wasn't asked? And how come I wasn't involved?" And I was thinking, my thought was, well, I'm getting you involved now, right? Like that's why we're talking about this. But I learned that their feeling was that the ship kind of already sailed. All this work had already been done, and they're just being included on the tail end of it, and that their input wouldn't be considered or as valuable. And so I started trying to Google around or read to figure out how I could have done this better. Somebody, right? I'm not the first one who's made this mistake, right? And I don't know where I came across it, but the phrasing stuck in my head: wide, narrow, wide. They were advocating that when you want to make these types of sort of more substantial architectural decisions, that you need to start out wide. You need to make the whole group, the developer group, of, hey, this is a question we're having. This is a decision that we want to make. These are the reasons why we're considering it, or why now, or what we want to do. Again, sort of giving the context. Right, so they're aware of it, and then going narrow and saying, hey, this is right. It's not going to be a productive, effective use of time if you have your entire development team all discussing this issue at once. So we're gonna have a couple of people who are closer to the problem, or more senior, do their research and analysis, and then they'll come to either document their research, or they'll come to some sort of, maybe not decision, but some recommendation. And then at that point, it'll be shared with the whole group again. But since the whole group knew in the beginning, they're not surprised by this thing coming out. They knew it was happening. They would have a chance to put in some initial input. They knew who was working on it, so right? If they wanted to go, have lunch with that person, try and discuss the architectural decision with them, they could. If they wanted to advocate for something they felt strongly about, they would have the opportunity to do so before they felt like it was too late. And then at the end of it, you kind of go wide again. You can either come to a consensus or you make it clear that this is the decision that was arrived at, or, however you're managing the team. But I keep it in my head now for any big decisions, wide, narrow, wide. Make sure everyone knows first before you're going off. And
that sounds like a very good framework, certainly. So now, I think switching gears more to like a fun/closing part of questions of the podcast. Um, Now, what skills or interests outside of tech that you have had or perhaps had, and how did it help, I guess, you grow as an engineer or as an engineering leader, if there's anything at all?
yeah, I don't know. It's a little tough. I mean, I was always kind of a geeky,
Uh,
nerdy kid. So I think,
so in general, I think you are interested in diving deep into details. Would that be like a trait?
yeah, I think that's fair. Like, yeah, just kind of being able to read a lot and learning a lot of the details and enjoying. When I started, I enjoyed a lot of minutia.
Uh,
That definitely helped as a learning how to program as an engineer. And
right.
I had the desire to know basically all the details, and so it wasn't just. And I didn't stop at the software side of it.
Yeah.
In college, I sought out courses on digital electronics. Uh, yeah, going deep, going all the way down to the transistor and knowing how transistors worked, or at least I used to know how they worked. And kind
Yeah.
of feeling like I was at least familiar with the entire computer from top to bottom. So not so much a skill, but an interest in.
Right. Just being, I guess, and knowing of how the whole thing fits in. And
Yeah,
uh, and I don't think you have a very good point there. I don't think, if you're not a person that is not interested in minutia, I don't think you can make it in programming because it's about all the little details that have to come together to make something work all the
yeah,
time.
it's
Different inputs, and it still has to smoothly. So I think that's a natural trait that I think really helps.
yeah. I think really helps if you want to be a software developer.
And in general, enjoy learning because you're going to be learning all the time. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
things are always changing. There's always new stuff, and and you need to enjoy it to keep up with it, I think.
Yeah. So now, if let's say you weren't in tech and if you had chosen a different career, what might that have been? And why would you have pursued that?
Um, so along the lines of being geeky and nerdy, if I wasn't in tech, I had, even before I actually ended up tech, I had wanted to be a physicist. I wanted to study physics. Um, and I think there's some similarity in the fact of wanting to know all these details and minutia and like what made the world tick, um, at least at the physics level.
Yeah.
Uh, it was maybe a little aside, but the way I ended up in software engineering was I wasn't even thinking about it. And I think it was junior year in high school. Um, I had another friend who, at the beginning of the school year, was like, "Hey, I want to learn how to program. I want to learn how to C. I want to learn C or C++. I forget exactly which. Um,
Yeah.
do you want to learn with me?" And I was like, I always liked computer. I liked video games, and I was always a little curious about programming, but never actually, for some reason, never actually really got into it. Um, and so I was like, "Yeah, sure." And we had a computer teacher in our high school. Fortunately, he agreed to help us outside of the classroom setting. That he was going to help mentor us as well. Um, my friend had given up within 4 weeks on the project, and I was absolutely hooked on programming from that point on. And so, yeah, so I was like, all right, sorry, physics. I think I'm gonna going to be a software engineer. Like, this is what I'm excited about. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess there are some parallels, right? Physics is all about nature and how everything works in nature, as in the physical universe, right? And I think at a thought level, you need to put things together in programming slash software, I think, which is a little bit of a parallel there, I guess, if you like to know how things work. And I think putting together things that work is like a similar related field, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think what really hooked me about programming is I got to, it was a creative outlet. I got to build things I wanted to build, right? Where physics was, let's understand what exists in this detail, and it's fascinating.
Right.
Right, the world is fascinating, but there is something really satisfying about being able to imagine something in your head and then being able to bring it about. And that's really satisfying.
Yeah, that really reflects how I felt in the early days about when I got into programming. That ability to bring an idea to reality, right, in a pretty short period of time. And yeah, it's fascinating. The whole problem solving and programming and all that stuff. So now, from your, I guess, career in tech, has it influenced your personal life or approach to life, or is this two different things in your universe?
I would say, I mean, the career in tech, I think, influenced my life, maybe not in the way that you're intending, but it's enabled a lot. As we discussed earlier, currently in Munich, I moved to Germany.
Yeah.
And I think being in the software industry, being in the tech industry has allowed a degree of flexibility and ability to move around the world or move to different locations that I think maybe another career would not have had.
Mm. So enable nice life experiences, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, very much so. And I don't know if it influenced how I mean, I'm sure it has influenced how I've approached life, but I don't know if I could articulate, or, maybe I approach life the same way I approach coding. And it's right. Why did it grab me so much? Right. Why did I get hooked on it so quickly? Because I think it fit well with how I thought in general.
So you think I did a pretty good job then?
Yeah, I think you did a really good job. I really enjoyed the questions. A lot of them made me think.
Yeah, I learned a lot in this session. I felt like I walked away with new information. Like the not white is one thing, but also the views you expressed about, like being very clear about how you set up a culture. So disagreements are okay, and it's the idea that's being attacked, not individuals. You can still be friends after having a heated discussion, right? So you arrive at the best decision. These are like some really good points. And I think some of the things that you had for people that are getting into tech was another very insightful thing. So fascinating.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
You should try and do what you love.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. James, I really appreciate you spending about an hour or so, or a little more than that, with us. And we'll see what the feedback is when we put this out.
Yeah, and thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely.
It was very enjoyable. It was really nice to have a conversation.
Appreciate it. And the feeling is mutual. Thank you.
Good. Thanks.
Thank you for listening. I hope you found this episode insightful. Join me for the next episode in 2 weeks where I interview another guest.